got to fix the slide, bud. You had 2 wins. I'm at about 4. 3 FLW wins in the series makes 4. And they can't count in Georgia. Very good. That's the problem, right? I appreciate you guys having me. I'm looking forward to this event and really looking forward. I'll tell you what, I'll be honest with you, I'm driving down the street here coming in. I've been flying on a plane all day today and kind of all nervous getting here, you know, trying to make it in time. I pull up and there's like cars everywhere. I'm like, oh, thank the Lord. This is great. So I appreciate you guys coming out tonight. It's going to be a fun tournament. I think, you know, like Clark said, there's just a lot of fish that bite on this lake and a lot of different ways to catch them, obviously. You can throw jerk baits, wiggle warts are good. I'm going to probably try wiggle warts, jerk baits. I'm going to take some of Clark's tips and use them to my advantage, hopefully. But one of the baits that I like a lot, and I've won a lot of money over the years, and I actually learned this technique again, just like Clark was saying, up here at Lake Beaver, or Beaver Lake. It's the football jig. And I know a lot of guys that fish every day up here, you know all about a football jig. But you know, for the guys and the gals that don't know much about a football jig, there's some really cool things with this jig that you can do to catch a lot of fish. And what I want to explain, you know, a lot of times when you hear about a football jig, you wonder, what is a football jig? You know, a jig's a jig, right? No, it's not. You've got your flipping jigs that you normally flip in bushes or standard head jigs. This is a football jig, and it looks like a football. It looks, you know, it's oblong. It's like a big egg, you know. And the reason it has that shape is it gives that bait a lot of action when you drag it on the bottom. Now, again, when you flip jigs, you're not dragging them. Normally when you're throwing a jig, you pitch it in a tree and you hop it up and down a few times, or you pitch it up by a rock and hop it over some rocks and fish it back to the boat standard. But with a football jig, it's a little different. You cast it out there and you drag it back to the boat. That's what I like to do. I don't like to lift my rod up too much. I like to cast it out there, long cast, and drag it back to the boat. And that dragging that bait along the bottom gives this jig a very unique action because of the design of that head. As it hits the rocks and the pebbles and everything on the bottom, that jig's rocking back and forth along the bottom. And it gives that bait a really unique look. It looks just like a crayfish, obviously. That's what we're imitating here. And that's what a crayfish does. You know, crayfish is crawling on the bottom. He's trying to get under the next rock because he knows if he stays out crawling around on rocks too long, he's going to get eaten by a big smallmouth or a spotted bass or a largemouth. So those crayfish that are crawling from rock to rock are trying to get up underneath things. So dragging this jig along the bottom imitates that really well. If you do the standard lift, you know, 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock standard worm fishing deal or standard jig deal, what you're doing is you're making your jig hop up off the bottom, 2 or 3 feet off the bottom, and come back down and hop and back and forth. And that's really not what a crayfish is doing when he's just naturally crawling along the bottom. So dragging it like a Carolina rig. A lot of people like throwing Carolina rigs. I fish it a lot like a rig. I drag that bait. And one of the other reasons you drag it, not only to give it that action that those fish like, is it makes a lot more noise. I mean, the more things you're hitting, obviously, the more noise it's making down there, bouncing into all the rocks, and it's kicking up dirt. You know, as you drag it along, and it's hitting some of the little dirt down there, and it's making little dust clouds, and it breaks that bait up a little bit, and those fish will react to that. And a lot of times when it's cold like this, these fish are going to be sitting down near a rock on the bottom. So as this jig drags along the bottom, making that commotion, kicking up that dirt, it makes those fish react to it. So again, I'll make a long cast with these football jigs. And let me also start off by saying this is a 3/4 ounce football jig. And that's most of the time what I throw. Occasionally I'll go to a 1/2 ounce if I'm fishing in real shallow water. But most of the time, you know, if it's 5, 6, 7, 8 foot deep or deeper, obviously, I'll throw that 3/4 ounce because I can throw it far and it keeps that bait on the bottom. So as I drag it on the bottom, it's not coming off. That heavy jig keeps that jig down on the bottom and again knocking into everything, so it really kicks up a lot of dirt. So a 3/4 ounce jig, you cast it far and drag it back to the boat. Now, where you want to fish it, you know, you can fish this thing anywhere, obviously. On these long gravel points, you can fish it on the stair-step rocky bluff walls. You can throw it up there and drag it off the bluff walls. But a lot of times this time of year, I'm looking for the ledge rock. A lot of times I'll get out there. It's not necessarily the big bluffy spots. Those are a little too deep. But I'll find those banks, those 45-degree banks, where it's got that ledge rock in it. Not just gravel or just standard rock, but a lot of times where you start to see those veins of rock that are like little steps. Because obviously when you see them up on the bank, that's what you're going to have down in the water as well. And that's what those crayfish like to bury up and burrow underneath those little rocks in there. And those are nice places for the bass to kind of congregate looking for crayfish. So I'll make long casts and drag that jig out at a 45-degree angle off the bank. and just drag it along. And you'll feel the fish pick it up. A lot of times you'll feel the bite, you know, a nice, normal tap, tap. A lot of times as you're dragging on those ledges, you'll drag it, and then all of a sudden it'll go weightless. You're like, man, what happened? You're reeling it. Your line's swimming off out in the lake. You better set the hook. I'll go ahead and tell you. Just reel down and set them. But that's just a really good technique this time of year. I can learn a lot about what's going on in the lake by throwing this jig simply because I can instantly tell what type of cover the fish are relating to that day. If I'm dragging that jig along a gravel point, for example, and then I come to a spot and the gravel will feel a certain way. It'll feel it'll just feel different. And then you might hit some bigger rock down there that you didn't even know was there. And you'll start feeling some bigger bumps as you're dragging along, and maybe you get a bite. Well, what are you going to do? You know, you're going to set the hook, and you're going to try to find more places like that, because obviously that's where those fish are going to be hanging out. So it's like a depth finder in a way. You know, allows you to figure out what's down there. You know, if you come over a log, a lot of times you can tell when it's wood that you're coming through, or a tree, or a bush. You can kind of really feel what's going on. And you know, Clark talked about fluorocarbon line, and on this football jig, most of the time I'll throw 12-pound line. Sometimes 15 if I'm really in some heavier cover, or if the water's a little off color, I can go up to 15. Most of the time, 12-pound fluorocarbon line allows you to, you know, detect the strike real well. Of course, it's really invisible underwater, and that's a good thing to do. Now, this time of year, I like to fish main lake. You know, the water temperature is going to be pretty cold right now, 39 degrees. So you're going to want to fish those main lake points, those secondary points going back into some of these spawning pockets. I don't think the fish are going to be too far in the very back of these things, so the water temperatures are probably a lot colder back there. So I'm going to fish in some of those main lake and secondary points. Let's also talk about the rod. Real important. I like a 7-foot rod for football jigs. Again, you're making long casts. You need to gather up a lot of line when you set the hook, so a long rod is important. If you get a 6.5-foot rod and you try to set the hook, you know, all the way out from the parking lot where your bait's at, you just don't have a lot of line, you know, you're not gathering up a lot of line on your hook set. So 7-foot rod's nice. This is a Kistler helium, real sensitive, medium heavy. I like a medium heavy action rod for this technique. It's got a nice soft tip, and it's perfect. You can catch smallmouth, you can catch spotted bass, largemouth, everything on it. Of course, this is a little Revo here, 6-to-1, nice little reel. So that's basically your football jig pattern, you know, and what you look for. Colors are simple. Browns, you know, peanut butter and jelly. I don't go black and blues too often unless I'm, you know, maybe way up to James or something and it's pretty stained. You might want to go to a darker color. Just match your trailer accordingly. This is I think this is a little Zoom twin tail here. Sometimes I'll throw the Yamamoto. Sometimes I'll throw a pocket craw. Just kind of play around with that a little bit. And the other last little tip I'll tell you is that little spider cut there. See how the skirt's all flared out? Especially in clear water. That's a neat little way to trim your jig. You can cut those skirts where they kind of all poke out like that, and it just kind of gives that bait kind of a neat little action, nice little look. So that's my football jig tip, and hopefully you'll catch a lot more fish with it. And I'll be around afterwards, so if you guys want to come and take a look at it or ask me any other questions, I'll be here.